Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. You are at Crossroads. Hopefully, that's where you intended to be. Thank you for being here if you're in the room. Thank you for joining us if you are online. Crossroads is a project of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa that we've been holding nearly 20 years. And at its core, Crossroads is really about civil dialogue and making sure we're having those important conversations that impact our community. And I'm Connie Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, and I'm just really glad that you are with us today. Before I forget, hopefully you know that there is a big event tomorrow. If you could open your hands, so the No Kings 2.0 is happening tomorrow in Des Moines. That's at the State House, and we hope to have thousands of people there. If you were at the 1.0, you will know we had issues with sound. We hope to have fixed that, so you should be able to hear everything. But if you are not in the Des Moines area, there are No Kings protests across the state. I saw 25, 30 across just Iowa. And so that is Indianola, even Ankeny, and just all over. So the one in Des Moines is at the State House on the west side and starts at noon. You'll want to get there a little bit early because hopefully there will be a crowd. So I hope that you will join us. And we have a fabulous Interfaith Alliance of Iowa has been part of a planning team and a great lineup of speakers. And they are all everyday Iowans who are impacted by this administration in different ways. And so we are not having speakers from organizations, we're having speakers who are storytellers coming from their perspective, and it should be quite powerful. So I hope that you will join us. But today for Crossroads, we're going to talk about that, that little thing called free speech, the First Amendment, and some of the history of that and what is happening today and what the challenges we're facing. So I'm delighted. We've had Mark Kende here before. Delighted to have him return. Professor Kende is the James Madison Chair in Constitutional Law at Drake Law School, as well as Director of the Congressionally, I was saying congregationally, endowed Drake Constitutional Law Center. He has been a visiting professor at Notre Dame School of Law and the University of Paris Faculty of Law, Pantheon. In addition to his book, Constitutional Rights in Two Worlds, South Africa and the United States, he has also authored many law journal articles on freedom of expression. He was a senior Fulbright scholar and chair of the section on constitutional law for American law. Or history academia. Professor Kende was a civil rights lawyer in Chicago. He attended Yale University and the University of Chicago Law School. Won't you help me to welcome Professor Mark Kende, please?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. It's an honor to see you. Good afternoon. Beautiful day outside. Politically, it may be slightly different than I do, but it's a beautiful day outside. So I'm going to talk about freedom of expression, give you a little background, but what I really want to do is tell you stories. It's amazing getting ready for this talk. There are so many examples of no, way higher. Hear me okay?
Yes.
So I was amazed at how many stories there are, and I don't mean good stories, just how much has happened with the repression of free speech. President Trump is clearly a somewhat authoritarian president in terms of his style. And the Americans are not fans of dissenting freedom of speech. And we live in a democracy. Democracy, freedom of speech is essential for the ability of people to make decisions, vote, etc. So this is kind of your background. So I'm just gonna start telling stories about different things that have happened and then save some time to catch up. So, that sound okay?
Yeah.
Again?
Yes.
Okay. So let's start with what I think is an interesting circular situation. He sends in various groups, ICE, the National Guard. He puts them in places that say, or he argues that this is the president and some of his aides, that some cities can't control a crime. Like Portland and Chicago seem to be his favorite targets. So as a Chicagoan, I resent that. But it's really bad for the city. It is really bad for the city. It is really bad for the city. So, now, what happens is protests start. And so the ICE facility outside of Chicago has had a lot of protests, but they haven't been massive and they haven't been violent at all. And the numbers I've heard, 20 to 40 people maybe at one time, maybe 100 people, but nothing uncontrollable. He's created the situation by putting these provocative troops in this very where they're going to go in, and they have gone into Chicago and pulled out people and sent them and deported them. So, feelings are high. Well, people have the right to protest in the United States. It's one of our basic free expression rights. And the reality is that he then says the city's out of control.
Yeah.
You see the circle? You put the troops there, you provoke everyone. People do get provoked and protest, but protest is allowed. And then he says, see, the city's out of control. It's brilliant, but it's wrong. It's wrong. The protesters have the right to free speech. It's a violation of their free speech rights, especially if there's no violence, there's no rights. So I just want to start with a story that sort of suggests there may be a bit of an attempt to try to make the situation what he wants it to be so he can send in these groups of people who can repress speech. So that's just one thing. Now, when you talk about sort of all this that's going on, and he says these cities are out of control, what happened on January 6th, 2020? It was a patriotic parade, wasn't it? According to him, it was not so bad. In fact, all of those people pardoned. They were all pardoned. People died on that day. Heroes died on that day trying to protest the senators. The saddest part that I heard was some of the people who were on guard tried to basically afterwards, they basically felt like they hadn't done enough and they committed suicide. So, it's so bizarre. I can't say that enough. It's disinformation. It's 1984. Everything is sort of upside down. And it doesn't make sense that you would say that's free speech when it's rioting, violence, and people dying. And, the other one in Chicago and Portland where none of that's happening. It's not protected. But we got to go beyond the National Guard. We got to go beyond ICE. If you want to ask questions about the legality of their deployment or whatever afterwards, I'm done. You can do that. So let's talk about universities. How are they doing? Harvard seems to be his favorite. He's got quite a legal battle going on. He's tried to pull, millions, if not billions of dollars of research funds from Harvard because Harvard won't follow the plan he wants in terms of curriculum and other things such as getting rid of DEI. And all of a sudden, I think this is all of a sudden the Republican Party has become very concerned with anti-Semitism, which is not a long part of its history, and I have nothing wrong with being concerned about anti-Semitism. It's a bad thing. But he uses Harvard's supposed failure in anti-Semitism, and it has had some failures, but he uses that, and he uses basically his power as the president to basically say, either you do what I want, or I'm not going to give you $400 million in scientific research funds, which results in speech, because what these scientists do is they write papers, and the papers help us learn how to handle things like diseases and other problems, and you end up, with the repression of speech. And I'm going to take it a step further. You want to talk about loss of lives? If you can't get good scientific research out there about how to handle certain illnesses and things because it's being repressed, that's a way to lose lives. Okay, so that's particularly troubling. He's also apparently become friends with Columbia. Columbia University has become another one of his friends, and that's become particularly ugly. Center for Disease Control, it's basically nothing now. If you watch some of the stories about what happened when he dismantled the Center for Disease Control, he got started with Bobby Kennedy Jr. I just have to say, a little bit of a disappointment, right? And, apparently running into some people there who are real scientists, who actually know science, who actually do experiments and are experts in the area of vaccinations and stuff, they disagree with them and he pretty much fires them all at once. And so CDC is a shell of itself. Again, we're talking saving lives. Okay? If CDC couldn't do the best work possible, it was thought of as, in some ways the best such organization in the world, or at least close to that, then you basically are losing lives. So that's another area that has been picked on. Measles went up significantly because Bobby Kennedy Jr. doesn't believe in measles needing vaccinations. I will say one piece of good news is Harvard is fighting the government. A few schools decided not to. It's pretty interesting. Harvard is fighting the government in court with regard to the government withholding funds. Harvard has won the first stage at the district court level. The problem is it's being appealed by the government, and it's going to end up probably in the US Supreme Court, which is clearly friendly to President Trump in terms of its approach to legal issues. It's a very pro-executive branch. We actually, I'll tell you a story. We had one of the Supreme Court justices came out and to our law school for an opportunity to interact with our students. He told us there's one question you can't ask me. We said, what's that? He said, don't ask me about executive power. So, being the smart ass I am, I tried to come up with a way to ask the question, and he wouldn't answer it. And I've also had the opportunity to work a little bit with Justice Thomas. Their views on executive power border on the monarchical. That these are kings, just like the protest is labeled tomorrow. And that's not what the framers intended. I'm not a big framers guy. I'm not an originalist. I don't go back in time and decide what the Constitution means now based on 200 years ago. But I do take it into account as a factor when I look at constitutional law. And sort of, to see this happening is just quite distressing. States are following. Iowa's basically banned DEI in the university setting. It's banned critical race theory in the university setting, which is a particular type of approach to looking at racial issues in this country. And these are clearly unconstitutional laws. It's a little more complicated because what they're saying is, if you do this, that's okay, but we're going to take your money away. So it's not just a ban. A ban may be completely unconstitutional. But when, and this is something to keep in mind, when the government says, we're going to give you money if, you actually have to comply with the if sometimes. And so that's the problem. So states like Iowa and other states have had problems. One area that he's failed completely at, which I'm glad to say, is law firms. He brought litigation against law firms, two Perkins Coys in Seattle, can't remember the name of the other one. About 8 or 9 big law firms signed deals with him, so they would keep their federal government contract lawyering and millions of dollars coming in. But others took him on, and so far the 2 cases that have been heard so far, the law firms have won because the idea is that he's repressing their ability to function by threatening in the way they are, and that this is free speech. Whether that will hold up or not, we don't know for sure, but it is a sign. There's a really interesting series of writings that some of you might find intriguing to look at about how our lower courts are really standing up for us and standing up for the Constitution in a way that the U.S. Supreme Court isn't. The lower courts are standing up, the federal district courts especially, are ruling against him pretty regularly. And of course, he's not in favor of that, so he's condemned that. But, you know, it's an encouraging thing that the lower courts that are generally a little less politicized because they're not serving on the Supreme Court are actually following the law. And so that's a bit of a encouraging thing, if you want to call it that. And I hope that does continue, but the problem is it may all end up in the Supreme Court anyway. But for now, law firms are safe, although, as I said, about 9 or 10 really famous law firms, some of the biggest on Wall Street, signed an agreement with the administration to give something like $400 million in pro bono fees to causes that he believes in. And, you know, what do we call that, blackmail? I mean, I don't want to say that specifically too bluntly, but it seems like blackmail. See, I'm a lawyer, so I'll say it seems like it has a blackmail element to it. So I want to talk briefly about Charlie Kirk. So we had this horrible tragedy. Charlie Kirk was assassinated. And I can't say anything other than that's horrible. I can't imagine what his family went through. His wife seems to have a merciful heart, which I think is incredible given what she's gone through. But, you know, the weird situation that happened after that was conservatives immediately started to say, if we find that you ever said anything on social media or on our work social media platform that was anti-Charlie Kirk, you can get fired. And a whole bunch of people across the nation got fired, usually with conservative bosses, on the grounds that they had said some things that were not favorable to Charlie Kirk. Now, again, it's a tragedy what happened to him, but his politics wasn't neutral. His politics, I think, was really troubling. But if it just produces something on social media, that's free speech. And so the idea that people will be fired from this reason, I think there's going to be a whole bunch of lawsuits here. And I just want to say, there's no doubt it was an awful thing. We don't want to have a violent tradition in our politics, although candidly, there is a little bit of that. So I do want to say that the repression of people who don't like Charlie Kirk is kind of interesting because it kind of reverses cancel culture. Okay, so what do I mean by cancel culture? Cancel culture and what's called wokeness are 2 terms that have been used over the years. Basically, conservatives for years said left-wingers are trying to stop us from talking. And they are the ones who work at all the universities, and they are the ones who don't want to hear about how great Trump is, etc. It's those left wingers who are the people who support cancel culture, and that's contrary to the First Amendment. But then right after Charlie Kirk dies, all these conservatives come out of the woodwork and say, the left-wingers need to shut up and not say anything bad about this guy. The cancel culture reversed within a day. Now, understandably, with an assassination and the tragedy there, people are going to have strong feelings. But I just thought it's just really interesting to see, this idea of cancel culture can work both ways. So I wanted to mention that. In terms of other things that are out there, there are lawsuits that have been brought against the media. Trump, I think, got some sort of a settlement in the millions from at least one of the major media companies. Can't remember which one, CBS or anything. And so that certainly deters these companies. Let's be honest, media is supposed to engage in free speech, but they're businesses, they're corporations, they do have obligations to shareholders, so that's going to have effects on them. The Associated Press was temporarily prohibited from being part of the press pool for activities at the White House. So, the Associated Press is really the source of so much news. I mean, most newspapers today, I hate to say this, are not as good as they used to be. And they get a lot of what you call pool reporting as the source. And that pool reporting comes from people who work at the Associated Press, as opposed to, there being so many reporters who work just for that newspaper or just there. So I think that has changed. I think some adjustments have been made, and the AP may be allowed that, but I'm not sure about that. And then, this is something I've already mentioned a couple of times, but just a lot of people have been fired. Anyone who speaks up against Trump in the administration is certainly out the door. Okay, and then you've got not just people who speak out against Trump, but anyone who speaks out and says anything that Charlie Kirk was a bad guy. I'm not saying he was or wasn't. I'm just saying if someone says that, they're going to get fired. There are just lots of people getting fired. And if you want to go way beyond that, right? They have whole departments of the government, not just the CDC, but the education department, other departments that somehow are viewed as hostile to conservatism. Now, I'm not sure how the education department itself is necessarily hostile to conservatism, but conservatives argue the education department was made up mainly of liberal left-wing people who have connections to the quote teachers union. That's got to be worse than positive. And therefore, we're letting our governments too big. They also make our governments too big. Well, we'll see how people feel about our government being too big when we try to get certain kinds of social benefits, and there's no one there to provide them if the numbers are going down. So the number of firings that are occurring are in the thousands, and to the extent that any of those people are being fired because of what they've said, there's a free speech issue. And last but not least, I just want to mention television. PBS, no more federal funds, NPR, no more federal funds, I believe. And who's the comedian on? Is it Colbert? Colbert. And so there's Colbert, who's gonna go off the air at the end of this year, and then the whole Jimmy Kimmel thing is a little bit confusing. It just does seem basically like, he is apparently a thorn in the side of some people who want to make a deal. And he's willing to actually say honest things about problems with the deal and problems with the entity he works for. And, he's tried to explain what he said. I thought he did a quite eloquent job of saying, I'm not condoning what happened to Charlie Kirk. It's awful. But I am allowed to have some views about maybe what he thought or what's going on with the networks, etc. So we've got Jimmy Kimmel, we've got Stephen Colbert. This isn't really a joke, but there are some people talking more about what's going to happen to Fallon and what's going to happen to Seth Meyers, who follows Fallon. So, and candidly, they serve a political purpose in our country. They're kind of our modern satirists, right? They get on television and they poke fun. Certainly poke fun at Joe Biden. over his age, poke fun at Donald Trump over a lot of things. So it's not like they're poking fun at just one side. And maybe it's easier to poke fun at someone than someone else. But that's, what a comedian is expected to do. So it may seem not that long, but I've actually gone through a list of about almost a dozen incidents of examples where free speech is being, I think, restricted in the United States. Now, we do want to add one caveat. Trying to do that again as a lawyer. That doesn't mean all of the restrictions are illegal. Okay, so I've tried to highlight what the restrictions are, but there are some restrictions that may not be found illegal by the U.S. court. Now, that doesn't mean they're good. If they're found legal, that doesn't mean they're good. It just means they're legal. I think generally, free speech, unless it gets to the area of something called incitement, i.e., President Trump's speech on January 6th, where he is, of course, immune now. He is immune from anything happening to him. And there were interesting arguments on both sides of whether what he did crossed the line, but the immunity takes that off the table. And there's a friend of mine who says, really all this free speech stuff is partly related to that immunity he's been granted, and the people who are carrying out his desires have been effectively granted. And I'm not sure I agree with that. I think it might be happening anyway, even if he didn't have that immunity, because he wasn't known for being shy before he had that immunity. The immunity came after his first term. He wasn't shy during his first term. He's bolder now. I think he just knows what he's doing a little bit more now as to how to sort of run things. The Justice Department is a real tragedy. The Justice Department was an independent entity, technically under the executive branch, but it was very much an entity that was designed to do justice, carry out the law without regard to partisan viewpoints. And it's very clear that the Republican Party, particularly the Trump side of the Republican Party, because I think the Republican Party is more complicated than President Trump, it's very clear that, the Justice Department is no longer independent. So we now have the 3 indictments in the last 3 weeks. Let's see, James Comey, Letitia James, and John Bolton, all enemies of Trump, all people President Trump has condemned as essentially traitors, without saying that exact word. I have to tell you, if you've ever followed the career of John Bolton, you can't get much more conservative than John Bolton. I mean, he was a hawk's hawk in terms of foreign policy. So to see him being treated as kind of I'll just use this word, you're a wimp. You're not really doing anything, and all you've done is you stole some classified documents. I mean, that's something you can understand the government would be concerned about. But if you're going after John Bolton to be a real true follower here, and if you think that's a good idea, that's, obviously you're entitled to your opinion, but, that's a sign of how extreme the Trump administration is with regard to being willing to repress free speech in order to serve their political needs.
Yeah.
So thanks. Let's take any questions.
Thank you, Mark. If you have a question, raise your hand and I will bring the microphone to you.
Thank you very much. Two-part question. Is the Republican Party still existent? And also, in Citizens United, is everything derived from that that's happened to us? Or is that the causative agent for the takeovers?
Yeah, those are good questions. I think the Republican Party still exists, at least formally, right? It does have a official office. It has a leader of the Republican Party. It has people running for office in Iowa. Iowa, the Republicans say it's got some people who, the only distinction I would draw is just like the Democratic Party, except a little more extreme. You know, the Democratic Party has moderates and more progressive, and I think the Republican Party has moderates and then it's got MAGA folks. And the argument might be, are the MAGA folks true Republicans? And that becomes interesting because true Republicans believe in certain things. They believe in small government, small state conservative government, which is exactly the opposite of what President Trump believes in. Okay, they believe, you know, in working together and you know, carrying out activities that don't result in national disputes and national violence. They tend to be on social issues more likely to be conservative, such as pro-life, okay, and abortion. They're probably not fans of hate speech, which is actually constitutionally protected, but they tend to be a little more fit and proper, I'm just using that term, in terms of voting. So the, you know, there are, you know, there is a conservative element that has always been, to me, fundamental to the Republican Party and refreshing. I won't tell you who this is, but we had a leading Republican come to one of our symposia, and her job was to talk about what it's like to work in state government. And it was Republican at the time. But she talked about how much collaboration there was. This was before President Trump. How much collaboration there was between Democrats and Republicans. Democrats had one house, so they actually could do things. And thus the Republicans had to interact with them. So, you know, that Republican Party is the Republican Party I like to think of. What we have now, it seems to me, is a Republican Party that has two elements, but one of them is very right-wing and extreme. But I wouldn't say they're not the Republican Party. I would say, in fact, they dominate in some ways the Republican Party now. In terms of Citizens United, I don't think Citizens United, surprisingly, maybe for some, has had that huge an effect with regard to the Supreme Court justices. Supreme Court justices are picked by presidents. You know, Citizens United, most of the money that has, there's a myth that most of the money that has been freed up from Citizens United has gone to Republicans because that was what everyone said. That's not true. Most of the money freed up by Citizens United has gone to Democrats. I have a friend. I have a friend. I have a friend at the law school who's an expert on election law. And I'm not a fan of Citizens United, so I'm not a fan for reasons having to do with secrecy involved that Citizens United allows and the lack of transparency. But my friend always likes to tell me, you should be a fan of Citizens United. It helps Democrats. And my response is, well, I like the idea of maybe helping Democrats, but I don't like the idea of the fact that we have this secret, untransparent set of people who are giving huge amounts of money, even if most of it technically is somehow determined to go into Democrats. But in terms of, does it affect the US Supreme Court? Well, then it really goes back to, does it affect the president? And my friend says most of the beneficiaries of money from the Citizen United case have been Democrats. If he's correct, then I would have to say probably not. If he's wrong,
Okay, my question is a little closer to home. Uh, When DEI was first announced, I received a letter as an alum of Drake University from the president and the president of the law school saying, you know, we're not going to abide by this. Is that still true?
basically, yes. With a little, maybe a little bit of a modification, but we're a private university. The Constitution of the United States generally applies only to state universities. So it's the Board of Regents who can tell Iowa State and Iowa what they have to do. The Board of Regents can't tell us anything. Now, we're not stupid. We know the times are what they are. So there were rumors that the current Republican legislature in Iowa might try to pass some laws extending their authority over education to private entities. Those rumors came after that letter, after Marty Martin and Roscoe Jones, who's a wonderful dean that we have, after they basically said, we're not gonna change anything, the message of Drake is inclusion. Okay, we are about inclusion. We like diversity. Okay, and we will continue to stand for those principles, hopefully, unless somehow the Republicans are able to sort of get a huge vote giving them control over private universities. And that's very rare, but it's not impossible to imagine that. So far, yes, we have stood by it. Now, the one spin I would put on that is I think we've made some things a bit more subtle in terms of names. So maybe include, I'm not positive, I haven't got all the details, but maybe instead of using the word diversity, we would use the word inclusion. But we don't change the underlying principles. We have a program that was designed for minorities coming in as students. It was called the CREW program. We've had to kind of fiddle with the CREW program a little bit. Not because we'd necessarily be sued, but you don't want to play with fire. And if you can do the same thing, avoid playing with fire, and that's pretty much what we've tried to do. And I think I think candidly, President Martin really deserves some praise for being willing to, in the face of actually potential repercussions in the legislature, saying this is one of Drake's principles, and it's a big one. And so I'm really, it's one of the things that makes me most proud. I don't think everything's perfect with Drake, but it certainly makes me it's one of the things that makes me most proud of still being a Drake, and hopefully it will continue.
First of all, thank you so much for coming today. I have an observation, and I have two questions to go with that observation. I carefully listened to what you said and referred to the Department of Justice in the past tense, and that really troubled me. If that legal guardrail has been removed, and you've removed all prosecutorial consequences, and that's my observation. My question is, how did we get here? And how do we get out of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. The Department of Justice used to operate in much of this country's constitution to be blunt. It functions because we let it function.
Yes.
It's about norms, not the text of the document. If we celebrate free speech, then we will have free speech. But even if it says there's free speech in the Constitution, if we despise free speech, we're not going to have it. So the norm for the Justice Department for years, and there are not just norm ideas, but there are written documents from an earlier period that suggest that they are supposed to be independent from the president, not under the control of the president, and therefore are supposed to make decisions without fear or favor, you've heard that term, without fear or favor, and certainly without regard to political party. Now, how did we get here? Yeah. I think the answer is that was a norm. That's not in the Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the Justice Department is an independent entity. The problem with norms, although they're great if people follow the good norms, is that if someone doesn't want to follow them and has the power not to, they can then undermine those norms. President Trump went into office, and I will give him credit for one thing. He did not hide this during his campaign. He was blunt. I'm going to make the Justice Department my Justice Department. It will not be independent. Now, I totally think that's a terrible thing. I think it violates the most basic principles of the rule of law, which are that we are trying to be impartial and trying not to be political in terms of how we handle this. And all the things that happen with regard to, part of it comes supposedly from his bitterness that he was subject to 4 or 5 different prosecutions. And he said, look at those Democrats. See, this is his argument. He's not a stupid guy. His argument is these Democrats went after me in 4 different lawsuits. One of them, he got convicted, 32 counts with regard to payoffs to a prostitute. So, but then came the presidential immunity case, and then came his election. And now it's Revenge City. And there is nothing but the norms out there. And he's just trampling on the norms. Now, the question just related to what you ask is what happens in 10 years if a Democrat gets elected? Do they kind of in a fit of revenge reverse everything Trump did? Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's not revenge. Maybe that's just justice. In other words, everything you said I think about and wonder about, and I just try to blame on him. But I wonder what happens in 10 years when the Democrats take office again, how they're going to undo what he's done. Because I think they've tried. And then, it goes back and forth. It's like one side does one thing, i.e. the Democrats prosecute Trump. Well, Trump becomes the leader, the president. He goes after the people who he thought were after him. And, in 10 years or so, the Democrat will get elected and there'll be a big issue. What should the Democrats do? Do they just act like Trump and put everything back the way it was? There are reasonable arguments that the system worked pretty well overall, that we were less polarized, et cetera. But there are some reasonable arguments that the system wasn't perfect. So I'd love to answer that.
Thanks. I'm glad I waited until after that response to ask my question, because it seems like you're giving us hope that there will be elections.
And you.
My question is, what is it? Is the presidency Trump, or is it the folks behind him? Because I'm much less afraid of an 80-year-old man that's losing his mind. I'm much more afraid of setting a new precedent for the presidency. I'd like your thoughts.
So my fears, I'll share with you. My fears are that he will, I'm just going to be blunt, that he will deploy the National Guard to screw around with the midterm elections. That's what I'm most scared of. To get into the Republicans win. They'll send them in saying, oh, there's reports of irregularities. And those reports just have to come from, people who are Republican. So I'm scared of that. I'm scared of the third term idea. That one terrifies me. Because that would just be such an obvious breach. When I said he was an authoritarian at the start, I really meant it. I mean, he is an authoritarian. He's not the kind of guy I see walking out of office. I'm done. I'm going to go retire, go back to Mar-a-Lago and play more golf. I could be wrong. If he's got a successor that he's fully satisfied with. So, I guess my short answer for your for your question is I have some really serious worries. So I mentioned 10 years because I was trying to be distant. I didn't say 3 years or 4 years. Because I do think a 10-year period gives enough time. It's hard to imagine, I could be wrong, that the Republicans will remain in control so much for 10 straight years. But I could be wrong on that. And the dangers that exist, like I said, what will happen with the midterms, the third term discussion, I'm just hoping that's a fantasy discussion because even he will admit sometimes he says things just to provoke people. And so, yeah, and there are other bad possibilities too. I mean, there's going to be more people he's going to be indicting who he believes were his enemies and were out to get him. And he thinks they didn't have good motives because, of course, why would you have a good motive? You sue me, the president.
Well, thank you for coming today. Let me make one little observation, then I have a question. As many of you know me, I'm State Senator Kornbach. I'm the ranking member of the State Senate Education Committee. With regard to DEI, the latest, broadest, worst bill is House File, I believe the number is 856. But in that, there are specific exemptions for academic departments, this is public schools, academic departments, academic instruction, student organizations, and advising student organizations. I don't say that to defend the bill. I hate it and I voted against it. I say that just in case you or anybody you know runs into any problem along those lines in your public school, community college, or at any of the state universities. There's protection for the academic programs. It's everything else that's under fire. The question I had for you, it also comes from an academic basis, but with regard to the Charlie Kirk controversy and some of the people who have been fired or threatened to be fired, I understand that there is case law which limits the freedom of speech of public employees more than applies to just the ordinary citizen.
100%.
And the language is something along the lines of effective and efficient operation of the organization. That language was used in President Winterstein's firing of the financial aid officer at Iowa State. Could you talk about how that is applied and what those limits might be?
Yeah, so there is a series of cases. I guess the most famous is called Garcetti, who was I think he was the sheriff or the leader of the police or the sheriff in Los Angeles. And the rule is that government employees can have their speech restricted. Okay, that's a rule that exists. Now, there are certain kinds of restrictions that are allowed and some that aren't. What are called viewpoint discrimination restrictions are generally not allowed, so that, you know, if you are saying the Republican guy in the government probably can speak, but the Democrat can't, that's no good. But if you have a general rule saying within our entity, political speech is not something we favor because it creates discord, that might be okay. In terms of your point about exemptions, I'm not so sure I agree with you the exemptions are as broad. Critical race theory is not exempted at the college level. I mean, it's banned. I'm not saying you're wrong. I agree with you. There are exemptions, but critical race theory is a really vital part of learning about this country, and you can define it in a bunch of different ways. You can define it narrowly, you can define it broadly, and if you want to have an administration that defines it broadly, then they can use it to do a lot of things. I do have colleagues who I've talked to who are concerned about how they literally, and they're in a private school, so they're not in danger. They've literally been concerned about how are we going to talk about race in a way that, you know, doesn't get close to the line, and they're not even affected. So I agree 100% with you. There are exemptions, they do exist. DEI is different from the academic programs, you're 100% right about that. But there are some academic approaches that are in view. And the idea that an academic approach that has lots of what many people would call legitimacy, even though I don't even agree with critical race theory. So I'm not sitting up here saying I'm a critical race theorist, I agree with it. Should be something my students in my constitutional law class know a little bit about? Absolutely. They should know something about it. They don't have to agree with it. I don't sell it to them as, here's the solution to all our racial problems if we just stop being critical race theorists. But your point is very well taken, and government does restrict the ability, as do private employers. Not even just government, but private employers can have much more discretion to say that their employees can't say things. So you're right on.
Thank you. My book club's studying the long document project 2025. It's really fun reading, not. So I'm sitting here, I Google freedom of expression and freedom of speech. No hits in 1,000 pages on either one of those. 28 hits, I believe, on First Amendment. Scanning through there, it seems like that document is quite supportive of the First Amendment. My question of you is historically, have conservatives and moderates and progressive defended those rights? Is this fairly new?
I think the general trend is kind of complicated. So until the early 20th century, there were no First Amendment cases. Until the early 20th century, although there were some controversies at the founding regarding what's called the Alien and Sedition Act and another act. But in the early 20th century, World War I was going on. And the court did not like it and upheld restrictions on the ability of people to object to the court. Then Justice Holmes, whom you may have heard of, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, and another justice, this isn't apparently a true story, had a train ride together and discussed this, and Holmes's position changed. And pretty much ever since that point, up until McCarthy, I think both sides were on board. The McCarthy era was a clear conservative effort to restrict speech that was viewed as communist on the grounds that it was dangerous. So I don't want to say the grounds were frivolous. I think what was going on was not exactly what was said was going on. But after McCarthy, it was pretty open. And then we got to this point, I don't know when it occurred in the 2000s, where we got into this debate as to whether certain entities could be canceled. And that the left wing was, according to the right wing, the left wing was canceling speech on the grounds that the speech wasn't politically proper and was woke. And I don't think we're quite out of that yet. I do think both sides now are in an interesting spot with what I think is the slight Charlie Kirk switch, where now you've got conservatives saying, don't hurt his memory. But I also think that's not exactly the same thing. So I think that we have a pretty good history of free speech. I think we have the freest speech the world has ever seen. So I'd like to highlight that. It's one of the keys to our democracy working. But when one side starts to tell the other side, we don't think you have the right to talk, and we think what you're saying is all political, and the other side has the same view of the sincerity, then I think you've got a problem. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Kende, thank you again for being here. So you are an expert in constitutional law, is that, I think, right?
Oh, sure.
That's your part of your background.
Yeah.
So here is what I've been pondering. President Trump took an oath, not once, but twice, to uphold the Constitution. He appears to be doing all kinds of things now that violate a variety of things. I would like, you made a distinction between a norm and something that's actually in the Constitution. Could you give us some examples of where he has of late truly violated the Constitution versus violated laws that were created by the Congress and that's signed by the executive? I'm just seeking to understand the distinction between those two things.
I believe the spending power is the clearest. Spending power belongs to Congress. He has done tons of things, millions of dollars trying to basically stop spending that's already been approved. He's impounded money. He has spent money to places where it was not necessarily agreed to. The spending power is a very important explicit provision in the Constitution. So to me, spending power provision. Now, I will tell you, I do not know if this court will agree with me. I don't know if this court will agree with me because the president's power, if you read the document, is so vaguely written. And if he's arguing there are national security implications, he throws in that one. But I think the spending power is one that more than almost anyone, at least to me, sort of seems to stand out. I've already mentioned some of the free speech violations. The placement of National Guard troops on soil of cities, that's a tough one. My own view is that this court will allow that if they get that issue, even though lower courts have kept them out of Chicago. Do you know that? The lower federal district court in Chicago said, you guys can't come into the city if you're National Guard. You got to stay at your base. Oh, what are you doing there? But putting aside what they're doing there, I think there are issues there. And some of those are statutory. There's something called the Insurrection Act. Is there really an insurrection? Some of those are statutory, but they have ties to constitutional provisions about war powers. Are we really at war? Because you think of the National Guard, you think of you're using them for war, and you think of the police, you think of them for local control. There are two statutes in particular that are being used by the Trump administration to justify the National Guard presence. One of them is the Insurrection Act. And then I can't remember the name of the other. It has a less fancy name, but it talks about if a city starts to lose control. But those are statutes. On the other hand, there's an act that just has such a great name, the Posse Comitatus Act. And the Posse Comitatus Act essentially says you can't deploy American military troops here to do policing. Now, but those are more statutory, although when the court deals with those issues, which it will, I have no doubt they will start and get into constitutional issues related to war and local federalism, etc.
The Supreme Court, the Supreme Court seems ready to nullify the Voting Rights Act. If that happens, would you share your thoughts about the ramifications of that?
I'm so depressed by that case. You know, they several years ago wrote a case about Shelby versus Holder. And Shelby was the case that was enacted to basically restrict those southern states that were most discriminatory and racist from being able to do anything without getting court or other approval. It was called pre-clearance. They had a formula, and if your state fit that formula, in other words, very few minorities voted, and not only very few minorities, but, you know, in general, you did some things that made it difficult for them to vote as well. And using the formula, it covered a certain number of states, and even some regions within states you wouldn't think of. So I used to live in Montana. There was a tiny part of Montana that was covered by the Voting Rights Act. So anyway, what we're dealing with now is what I think is a broader law, the broader part of the Voting Rights Act, which essentially, you know, basically says that, you know, when you are doing redistricting, you generally are not allowed to take. This is the argument that is being made by the administration. You're not allowed to take race into account. And the problem with that is the whole point of the Voting Rights Act is to allow you to take race into account. That was the whole point, because of our history, which was horrible. And so everyone thinks Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954, started the Civil Rights Revolution. That's actually, Brown didn't do very much, since it's one of the myths of our Constitution. 54 to 64, Brown didn't accomplish much in terms of desegregating schools. But in 64, they adopted the 64 Civil Rights Act. And in 65, they adopted the Voting Rights Act. And most civil rights advocates would say those two acts combined with Brown were what made a difference. So from 64 to the early 70s, the country's racial composition within schools started to become much more integrated. This is a slightly different issue than voting, but I think it's related. But then they eventually ruled the other way in a case, stopped the ability of schools to be integrated. And I think what they're doing with this issue is they're going to try to stop this statutory provision from being used. And I think that risks the likelihood that it'll become harder for districts to be drawn that do take account. Louisiana was the case. I think some of you know that. Louisiana had drawn 2 districts that had Black majorities. And these good old whites came forward and said, you can't do that because they're so oppressed. Be white, you need to be. They're so oppressed. I'm just, sorry, joking a little bit. And so, you know, I think they're going to win. Everyone who's seen the oral argument so far thinks that they're going to win. Chief Justice Roberts does not like any kind of affirmative action. So I'm a pessimist, and I think it would be a real bad development. It would mean that the estimate I saw yesterday was between 5 and 13 seats would shift within the House to become Republican, which is already a Republican House. That was the estimate if the court ruled for this part of the Voting Rights Act was.
And on that note,
Sorry.
help me to thank Professor Mark Kende. Thank you for being here. I know it wasn't a very happy conversation generally, but it's good to be informed and to have knowledge and to have information. And that takes me to always being involved, using your power and privilege, using whatever means that you have to be involved, because we do have to. Our phrase that we're using this year in Interfaith Alliance is reclaim our democracy. And so I urge you to be part of that, be at No Teams tomorrow if you are able, and join us there, along with hopefully thousands of other people saying that we have no team in this country. So thank you. Have a great weekend.